Hello, my name is Kat Manjanti, and this is my narrated presentation for Prompt 3. In this presentation, I will discuss the educational challenge I chose, English language learners in the classroom. We will discuss what it is, its history, the importance and challenges of teaching ELLs, some viewpoints regarding teaching ELLs and its prevalence in the classroom, as well as how I work with ELLs in my classroom. So, first, we need to define the term. ELL is short for English language learner, and this term refers to students who primarily learn English as a second language. This is further defined as difficulties in speaking, reading, writing, or understanding the English language, according to research by Barrow and Workman Pithers, that hinders students from accessing and achieving in the general education classroom. Additionally, there are foreign domains of language learning that teachers need to pay attention to when working with ELLs. That is reading, listening, writing, and speaking. Every language has these domains, and our students are learning all four of these at the same time. In my experience, writing tends to be the last one to kind of click into place because there's so much personal production. But not speaking, listening tends to be the first one to click into place since it is a little bit more passive and you're not necessarily having to produce the sounds yourself. And next, I have a quote that establishes a little bit more about why this is a challenge in education. So, the issue of educating ELL students is now widespread throughout the United States and no longer remains a regionalized policy issue, as ELL students are found in almost 50% of all districts and schools across the country. This is from a paper written by Gottfried. Again, this is more of an issue because teachers are seeing this more and more and more in the classroom with the demographic shifts that we have had in the United States. Teachers are just more likely to encounter ELLs, not even just in their career, but just in the next school year. So it is becoming more and more of a teacher's responsibility to be aware of this and to be equipped to handle it. So, next, we're going to cover a bit of the history of ELLs in the US education system. So, some fast facts. ELLs are the fastest growing population in the United States, specifically children of immigrants. That number is 57% as of 2011. In a court case, Law versus Nichols in 1974, this held that school districts must take affirmative steps to help students overcome language barriers so that they can participate meaningfully in each school district's programs. This is from research from Calderon et al. So, this means that it is a school district's responsibility to educate all of their kids and to make sure that every student is able to access the curriculum, even the ones who don't speak the language. Additionally, the federal government requires services for ELLs, but states determine the policies and practices for identifying and assessing them. So states don't necessarily all do this the same way. Historically, states like California, Florida, and Texas had more ELLs than others, but other states are seeing these numbers rise yearly again due to these demographic shifts. Therefore, most teachers will teach or interact with ELL students, so this challenge affects all involved in education. And then finally, one last point on this, about 79% of English language learners in the United States speak Spanish as their native language, and much lower shares speak Chinese, Vietnamese, Hmong, and Korean. One of the assumptions that teachers tend to have when talking about ELLs is that we are specifically talking about Spanish speakers, and that's not necessarily the case. In my experience, I have had many different languages in my classroom. In my first year, I had a student who came here from Tokyo and only spoke Japanese. So ELLs aren't always Spanish speakers, and I think it's important for us to remember that. So next, the importance of ELLs. There are many benefits to having ELLs in the classroom. These include increased inclusion and exposure of diverse cultures, increased development of interpersonal skills for both sets of students, both general education students and English language learner students. There's an increase in developing student empathy and social emotional skills, and it helps students become more culturally aware and responsive. This helps them understand a little bit more about cultures that are different in this. Earlier in my master's program, I did a whole research project about culturally responsive teaching, and some of the effective practices involved bringing in student cultures into the classroom. Teaching ELLs is a really great way to expose students to other cultures that they wouldn't necessarily have the opportunity to see on their own. So, given that ELL students are often themselves from different countries, there may also be classroom opportunities to improve other classmates' approaches to learning by exploring new and foreign ideas and experiencing different cultures and backgrounds. For example, in my classroom, I do have a lot of Spanish speakers this year. And so one of the activities that we did to bring culture into the classroom was we worked with our Spanish teacher to build an ofrenda in the hallway for Dia de los Muertos. That was a good way for my students who didn't celebrate that holiday to be able to experience what that is and to be able to interact with it and ask some questions that they wouldn't have the opportunity to ask otherwise. And so that was a good way to bring some of my students' family life into the classroom, which is a good way to be a culturally responsive teacher. Now, while there are lots of benefits to teaching ELLs, there can be some challenges to teaching them as well. Some potential challenges include that it can be hard to identify other issues that a student might be having. For example, I have a student right now who speaks Spanish primarily. He is not very fluent in English yet, still only knows a few words and phrases. But I noticed his speech impediment because he would say the word ocho, eight, as oso, which is bear. That makes it very hard for him to understand, or for me to understand him and for others to understand him. And it's an impediment that I've noticed in English as well. And so that tells me that there's kind of a real root issue there. But I was more easily able to identify that, more quickly able to identify that because I spoke the language. If a teacher doesn't speak the same language that the student speaks, then it can be much harder to identify those kinds of things until you pair them with a another speaker of the same language, and it can delay that process since so much of those struggles can be attributed to just learning English. Some students struggle for reasons beyond second language status, sociocultural backgrounds, and educational history, as Garcia and Tyler establish in their paper. And so it's can be a challenge to identify those things for our ELLs. Additionally, communication between home and school is harder. For example, even though I speak Spanish, I feel much more comfortable having another adult translate a conversation on the phone that I need to have with a parent because I don't know the language well enough to know all the nuances. I don't know all the language well enough to make sure that I'm always being polite and respectful of the parents just because I just haven't been speaking it long enough. So it can be harder to have those conversations because we have to be so reliant on translation services. Additionally, it's more challenging if you're handling more than one language in the same classroom. Last school year, I had three languages in my classroom. I had Portuguese, Vietnamese, and Korean. And two of those students were at very, very early um, stages of learning English. I had one iPad to share between the three students. That made it really hard to teach them all the time. I was very reliant on translating things into Vietnamese and Korean and Portuguese for those students. But again, I was able to be more reliant on that because I was teaching fourth grade and they had some proficiency in their home language. If I was working with a younger grade level like I do now, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that because I wouldn't be able to rely on the fact that my students were literate in their first language as well. So this can be a hurdle that student or that teachers have to deal with when working with ELL students. And finally, many teachers have limited resources or training on how to meet the needs of those students. We just don't get a lot of training on it. And so it can be really hard for teachers to always know the best practices for working with those students and the best ways to present content in a way that they can understand. So that's another reason this can be particularly challenging. And finally, ELLs may proportionally utilize a disproportionate amount of teaching time. They may need more of that teacher time, and they would skew the teacher's ability to monitor other students or to properly interact with them. So that could be a negative downside to students, general education students being in an ELL classroom. Um, that could be hard for those students. It could take time from students who would need to be pushed, would need to be challenged, because the teacher might need to slow the pace for the rest of the class to kind of bring it to a level where those students can understand, depending on how many of them there are. So those are some challenges that we might face when working with ELLs. Um, Experts have many opinions about how to teach ELL students, but most of them agree that one of the two options here are bilingual education and English language immersion. So, people who support bilingual education argue that students still need help with proficiency in their first language. Again, specifically, I guess we're targeting kindergarten through second grade. And the students need time anyway to become English proficient, and this keeps them from falling behind in their academic content. Bilingual education would be taught in students' home languages as well as English, so the academic content, like life cycle is here shown in the life cycle of a butterfly, that kind of content would be covered in their first language so that they would still be able to learn that without necessarily having the hurdle of not knowing English. People who argue for English immersion argue that English should be learned as quickly as possible to receive all the benefits. And they argue that there is a critical period of language acquisition that once a student exits that period, they are not going to be able to learn that language anywhere near as quickly, and it will slow their growth overall. So, though there is an argument over the best model for ELLs, most public schools follow an English immersion model due to just lack of resources available and teachers available to cover that post. So, how is this prevalent in the classroom? More than 50% of school districts have students who qualify as ELL. This is the fastest growing portion of the student population with the highest growth in middle and high school. Again, this is research from Calderon et al. And in my personal experience, I have had at least one ELL every year as a teacher with students from Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, and Brazil. Those were all students that I had that I taught them in their first year in the United States. I've also had students who spoke Arabic. I have had students who spoke Hindi. I have had students who spoke lots of different languages at home. I had a student who spoke Farsi last year. I have had a wide ranging amount of representation of cultures in my classroom. And a lot of those all were within the same couple of years where I had multiple languages in the classroom. This school year, I have 14 students who qualify for ELL services out of my 19 overall students. And they're all in varying points of the program. All of these students are or Spanish speakers. Sorry. At the beginning of the year, I had 7 students who were newcomers to the United States who had come to the United States within the last year, and all 7 of them came from different countries. I had a few from Mexico, I had a few from Guatemala, I had one from Nicaragua, I had one from Cuba. They're from all over the place. And so, in my personal experience, ELLs are a growing number of the population, and they are very, very prevalent in our schools, and teachers need to know how to be able to best serve them. So, how have I used this information in my own instruction? Over the last 2 years, I have taught 18 ELL students who spoke Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, Arabic, and Portuguese. And these are some ways that I have used what I've learned to benefit my students. So I've shared ideas that have worked in my classroom with my team since we all serve a similar population, especially this school year. For example, one thing that we did was anytime that we share or create a resource that we really like, we kind of put them all in the same Google Drive so that everybody has access to it. I've also used my knowledge of Spanish to help my students find confidence in what they already know and to create connections to new content. For example, when we were teaching at the very beginning of the year, we were reviewing vowels, consonants, open and closed syllables, a lot of things from first grade. I noticed that some of my Spanish speaking students, they knew their vowels, but in Spanish, vowels are much more fixed. Spanish is a very phonetic language, and so every single letter has just one sound for the most part, especially with vowels. In English, our vowels can say, I think it's between 20 to 25 different sounds. So an A can say it can say a lot of different things. In Spanish, it always says ah. And so I tried to make connections for my Spanish speaking students to the sounds they already knew. So when we did short vowels, a lot of those are pretty close to, especially the first couple ones, are close to what they already knew in Spanish. So I tried to help them build connections to what they already knew. Um, Next, I've involved parents in the process by helping them learn how to help their children learn English at home. I do have a lot of parents who do not know English or who cannot read themselves. And so I've tried to provide them with resources like Epic Books, Libby, some resources where students are able to listen to others reading in English so that they can better learn themselves as well, and have tried to help bridge that gap for families and help them feel more involved and feel more like they're able to support their kids. I've also used information from district-led trainings to help lead my instruction. So an example here is a question words poster that we created in a knowledge building um, training. This is a question words poster in English and in Spanish, and it has lots of pictures on it. So it has pictures of the kinds of things that you would be able to put in that. So, for example, under when, we have a clock where there's a list of the days of the week. There are things that you would put into that category that would answer that kind of a question so that kids have an idea of kind of what we're talking about. And this helps students identify words that they might already know and connect them with the English equivalent. Um, Regarding involving parents in the classroom as well, I've also included here my flyer that I created for my Parent Education Efforts project that talked a little bit more about how to bring parents into the classroom. I think parents are very, very important, and specifically with ELLs, they're essential to helping those students learn because those students need to know that their parents think it's important for them to learn English as well and for them to be able to do that to succeed in the classroom. So it helps for everybody to be on the same page, and I've included this flyer as an example of how I have been able to do it and how I have done it in my classroom. Finally, I'm going to show some examples of what I do in my classroom to support my ELLs in all four domains of language. Many of these examples are specific to phonics instruction, but I do use them throughout the rest of the day as well to support them in science instruction, social studies instruction, math instruction, a lot of those different camps as well. So the first domain we have is reading. Some strategies and tools that I use for reading is phonemic awareness and explicit instruction of that content. Many ELLs need specific instruction. They do not already know the language, so they need somebody to show them the specifics of it, and they need that taught to them exactly. So here I have a cue card that I use in my classroom. It is for the letter I. We start the year by using these for short vowels, and so we would do the middle line. And what I would do in front of the whole class, I would stand up and I would say, okay, guys, repeat after me. I, itch, I. And they would all repeat it. And while we're doing that, I would scratch my nose or something, go, I, itch, I, and give them a hand motion as well to do. So they're seeing the card themselves, they're seeing the letter, they have emotion, and they're saying the sound themselves. It was very hard at the beginning of the year to encourage my ELLs to say these sounds as well, but with repetition, they got much more comfortable with it. And now I hear them saying it all the time. Next, we have writing. So in writing, I've been using dictation pages. We've been doing, again, this in our phonics instruction, where I have been saying a word, usually a word that is related to the phonics skill that we have been working on. So, for example, if we were working on vowel teams, I would say the word play. And for that vowel team, for AI and AY, I might say, okay, guys, remember one of these we use in the middle of a word, one of these we use in the end of a word. Which one am I going to use for play? And then I would sound out the word, tap it out, play, and they would write it out on their piece of paper. The dictation pages looked a lot like this. This is actually more for high frequency words, but it has a similar structure where you have lines where students have an opportunity to practice. This high frequency word page is continued targeted practicing of explicit skills. For example, here they're writing their consonants in blue and their vowels in red, just really trying to hit home what they're doing. So actually what I could see from this student was that he misunderstood the directions for at least the first two. I think I helped him on the last two. Or at least I helped him on number 3. So what this told me when I went back and looked at it was this student needs a little bit more targeted instruction on consonants and vowels and might need a reminder of it. Next, we have listening. So for listening, we have adding and subtracting sounds and words and reading out loud and listening for specific sounds. So an example for listening might be, I would say out loud, okay, I want you to add s to pit, add s to pit. And the class would repeat spit. And you would do things like that all the time and kind of try and maneuver words and kind of maybe come up with word trains where you can do like a whole train of things where you're adding and subtracting sounds over and over again. This page here is an example of where we would do a listening activity where students would follow along. They would tap along with what I was reading on the screen, and they would highlight words that have the ah sound. So this was when we were working with AU and AW. So you can see this student highlighted the word launch, the word taught, the word saw, and yawn, and he was highlighting everything that he heard as we were doing this. So that would be an example of a listening activity. And then finally, speaking. Speaking is one of the harder things for a lot of our ELLs to do, especially if they're newer to the language. So giving them opportunities to practice complete sentences is essential. So I do this a lot in my morning meeting, and I do this with sentence stems. So they would have sentence stems, or they would practice known phrases and encourage complete sentences. I would encourage complete sentences when possible. So an example of that would be, I would start with a greeting and say, "Good morning to be friends. I'm so happy to be back with you today. I hope you had a great weekend." And they would say back, "Good morning. Something fun I did this weekend was," and then they would say something they did this weekend. Additionally, we would talk about our feelings a lot, give students an opportunity to kind of connect with that social emotional side. And I had a picture of all of the different emotions along with a word underneath it. We might talk about what a couple of them are, as some of my more fluent students would say an emotion. I would point to the one that they talked about to help some of our friends identify what they were talking about and kind of help give them a visual. So that's an opportunity that I have taken to really practice complete sentences with my kids and to give them chances to um, develop their own complete sentences in kind of a low stakes setting. And finally, I've listed my references for this presentation. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate it.